Hi, my name is Martin Purnell and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and for those that are disillusioned. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation and not necessarily change your mind prior to listening. You can contact us as well by email, ogc@accessradio.biz, biz is spelled B-I-Z. Check out our Facebook page, Off-Grid Christianity, and we have our own website, offgridchristianity.co.uk. So please enjoy today's guest, who originally trained as a barrister, but also found time in 2008 to work alongside other lawyers in Kenya, Rwanda and Uganda. Our guest is now a trustee of the Lawyers Christian Fellowship, which has over 2,000 Christian lawyers. Our guest also was a consultant to an NGO at the United Nations and is known for pursuing settlements that are fair for his clients. What does fair mean in a world where more and more people want and get eye-watering figures now in court? What did he learn about law in Africa? How can he reconcile his Christian faith with certain morals raised in court, especially from clients he's representing? What does a trustee do? And what exactly is the reason for LCF? And of what benefit is there from a client's perspective? It gives me great pleasure to welcome to Off-Grid Christianity a partner in a well-known firm of solicitors and head of their employment law, Tim Grainger. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell me, where are we speaking to you from?
Hi, Martin. It's great to be here. I'm speaking to you from Warrington. For those that don't know where it is, it's in between Manchester and Liverpool. That's probably what it's best known for, I think. And it's convenient, but it's been home now for about 15 years, probably, or thereabouts. So.
Now, having lived in Stoke for quite a few years, I know full well you have not got a Warrington accent. So where are you from originally, sir?
So originally the north coast of Northern Ireland. So born in Belfast, and then moved up with my family to the north coast. So a lot of fond memories from there. Very much always love going back and seeing the seaside and the beach and everything else.
Yeah, I bet. No doubt that'll come into conversation later on. But before we get there, let's ask you those 5 important questions, or maybe not so important, the 5 interest getter questions. So if you're sitting comfortably, fingers on the buzzers, no conferring. Question number 1, Tim. If you could invite anybody from history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who would it be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I gave this quite a bit of thought, probably more thought than I should have, to be honest. But I suppose a fairly light-hearted answer. I'm a Liverpool fan. I have been for many years, and one of the joys of being able to move up to this part of the world has been able to actually go and see them at Anfield. So I think Jurgen Klopp, notwithstanding his decision to leave the club, I would like to sit down and have some dinner with him and talk things through with him.
What would you actually ask him if I could arrange it?
I'd probably say don't go, first of all, don't leave. No, I think what impressed me about him is that he's got a really good way with people. He's more than just a manager. He understands people and how they tick.
Mm-hmm.
He seems to be quite an unusual guy in that respect. And in the job that I do as well, and I manage people and whatever else, I think it'd be interesting to get some insight from him as to how he can get the best out of people and kind of bring them on and things. So we'd start with football and then probably ask a few more deeper questions beyond that.
Like, how do you throw a hairdryer at a player sort of thing?
Yeah, he's not known for that, although I think there's a temper there, I'm sure, somewhere.
I'm sure there is. Apparently, he's a Christian, so I hear. Is that true? Have you read that?
Yeah, I've read that. I think since his father died a number of years ago, he would have returned more to his faith. I think, I don't know how sort of personal his faith would be, but I think given how he is, how he comes across, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he's a good personal faith there.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Let me know how it gets on. Perhaps you could arrange for me to have an interview with him as well when he turns up for your meal later on in the week. What would you cook him, by the way, if he did turn up?
I can only cook spaghetti bolognese, so I think spaghetti bolognese, and probably I could find a good German beer for him. Could maybe share a nice German beer together. But my cooking, I'm not known for my cooking, has to be said.
Well, I'm sure he'd be humble enough to eat spaghetti bolognese. Go for it. Question 2. Who is your favourite biblical character or favourite biblical story or favourite parable, please, Tim?
It's maybe quite a common answer, but I think Peter, because he's such an honest guy, really, and I can identify with how he can be, really on fire one minute and then full of doubts and, doing and saying stupid things the next minute. So I think he's someone who I admire his passion, his honesty, and his humanness. So I think in that respect, I think he's quite a character, really.
Yeah, we haven't had Peter for ages, actually. What stands out the most as far as Peter's concerned?
When he tries to walk on the water to Jesus and sort of, gets into a right mess and takes his eyes off Jesus. And I think, it's spoken about many times, but I can really identify with that you sort of, you get into a real flap about things. You sort of forget what the main thing is and where your focus should be. And But yeah, and how Jesus is with him is lovely because the guy's all over the place, and yeah, Jesus shows an incredible love and compassion and grace, and I think it just gives us all real hope that that's how Jesus is with us and how much he loves us. So yeah, I think it's just a lovely walking illustration, really, in lots of ways.
Yeah, and he does actually get out the boat. That's the thing, doesn't he?
Exactly.
How many of us would have
Yeah.
done that, even though he didn't
Yeah.
get that far, but he did. Yeah, one of only two people, as far as I'm aware, to ever walked on the water without any aids. I'll just put that in there.
That's
as
right.
well. Question 3. If you were Prime Minister for the day and could change any law or impose new law, what would it be, please, Tim?
I mean, I wouldn't want to be prime minister even for a day, but I gave this wee bit of thought, and it maybe is a bit of a strange answer, but I'd actually like shops to close on a Sunday. I just think life is so hectic, Monday to Saturday as it is. Sunday can just feel like another day, and I think just having that sort of complete quietness, complete rest in a sense, that might go some way to helping it. And it means we would have to do our shopping in 6 days, granted, but I think that'd be quite a nice thing. It keeps Sunday a bit different, a bit special.
Would that be mainly for people's mental health, or are you going back to certain biblical standards here?
To be honest, more mental health, because I just think we're running around so much. We're exhausting ourselves 7 days a week. That's not what we're designed for. So I think that's the biblical standard. Actually, it's for our own good that Sundays are supposed to be days of rest. So, and because of all the mental health issues there are at the moment, I think actually a day of enforced rest would do none of us any harm.
Very good answer. Thank you. Whether you'll get that on the statute books, I doubt it.
I doubt it.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to watching that on TV as it develops. And how all the businessmen say, no, he can't do this. He's going to change so many jobs and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
I think you're going to have to get a lawyer in who knows something about employment law.
Yeah, you need to find one somewhere,
Yeah. I've got an idea. I'll tell you about it off air afterwards. Question 4. Outside of family events, Tim, what has been your most enjoyable day out, sir?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's really hard actually when you take out the family stuff, because I think so many great days I always associate with family, whether it's growing up or my current family, sort of as we are now. But I suppose maybe a boring answer is when I was called to the bar 2002, 2001. That was quite a special day, just because there was a lot of work went into that, and there's a lot of sort of pomp and ceremony about the whole thing, and being there with mum and dad was nice, and being in London, all that kind of thing was just a nice sense of achievement. So that was a good day out. There's been so many, to be honest, but that was one that definitely stands out and I'll remember, I think.
Yeah. I've often been called to the bar, but from a different point of view. Why is it called the bar as a matter of interest in lawyer speak?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I think it's probably to do with the bench, if you like. So where a judge would sit is often called the bench, and if you kind of are going towards the bench or the bar, I think that's maybe where it comes from.
Okay.
What actually happens is you're called to what's called the utter bar. It's quite an archaic sort of ceremony, when you go through all of this and whatever. So yeah, I mean, it's the origins are steeped in a lot of history, but it's quite nice, I suppose, that all that's still there and still is traditional, I suppose, in lots of ways.
Yeah, very much so. And it shows you just how American TV has an influence on us in this country, because we keep thinking that a judge has a gavel and hits the gavel, send him down. That doesn't actually happen in real life in the UK, does it?
No, it doesn't. Not at all.
Question 5. What has been your most embarrassing moment, please, Tim?
I was probably fortunate. I couldn't think of too many, which is maybe a good thing, or maybe I've hidden them so much that I can't remember them at all. I suppose when I was in Africa, there was a birthday cake or a birthday celebration, and there was something in the cream which didn't agree with me. And I remember waking up the next morning thinking, my tummy's not quite right here. And yeah, I think it was then having to take various tablets and things to sort of stop bodily functions going a different way. That was probably fairly embarrassing. We were going to a prison the same day. Yeah, I just thought, I need to make sure everything stays where it's supposed to stay here. This could be very embarrassing. So that was pretty unpleasant. Thankfully, nothing came of it in the end, but it was embarrassing feeling like that all day.
Great stuff. Well, thanks, Tim, for that. Let's crack on then and see how long it's going to take before we talk about the main thrust of the interview. But as I said to you off air, it's quite often amazing just how often we digress and go on a completely different subject. So let's see how we get on. But first of all, why did you want to become a barrister in the first place?
Well, I wanted to be a lawyer, first of all, because there's all kinds of reasons. I mean, bizarrely, probably the starting point was when I was at school. There was a friend of mine who, well, he wasn't really a friend. He was an acquaintance, if you like, and he was being bullied by a couple of lads, one of whom was much, much bigger than either of us. My frame, I'm a runner, and I'm thin, and I have no muscles. at the top of my body
Mm-hmm.
whatsoever. So I wasn't exactly physically in a position to challenge this guy, for this guy being bullied. But I felt there was something within me that just didn't like that sense of injustice, if you like. And I think probably from that moment onwards, when I see that kind of thing happening, and when I see someone being, oppressed or whatever it is, it makes me angry. It makes me want to get involved and to help them. And that was the genesis of it,
Mm-hmm.
actually. But then also because law is challenging, it's intellectually stimulating, and I like that. I like the idea of having to grapple with things. And then I think when you apply the law to real life situations, it's really interesting because it's alive. You're getting to kind of apply the law to someone's life. And I think the idea of being a barrister originally, I wanted to be able to speak for someone in a court
Mm-hmm.
setting, and that kind of fueled the desire to study law. And then I went to Queen's University, and then at that point you have to make the decision: do you stay in Northern Ireland, or do you try and go across the water, as we used to say? And for me, without going into lots of detail, things didn't go at all as I expected. I had in my mind what I wanted to do and wanted to achieve, and when God's plans and purposes were really quite different. And I had a number of years where things, I was called to the bar, but then I had about 6 years, 5 or 6 years in London trying to get what they call a pupillage. And it was really competitive. You had hundreds of people applying for two places. All of them, everyone had a law degree and had done all kinds of other extracurricular things. I got really close to a couple of chambers, which is what they call where barristers are sort of based, and it didn't work out. So I ended up kind of doing any job that I could for 5 or 6 years. I wanted to stay in London because I had friends there. I had a really good church, felt really at home, loved London. But I was, photocopying things. I was working anywhere I could just to bring in enough money to pay rent, and then ultimately transferred over, became a solicitor, which is a whole other story where I'm at now. But this idea of representing people, standing up for people, and that still drives me now. That's still why I do the job. I still do it because I want to help people, and that, I hope, is what gives me the motivation
Yeah.
every day, some days more than others, to do the job.
Yeah. Well, you're a Northern Ireland person from Northern Ireland, as they say over here, living in England. From England, now living in Northern Ireland. We speak the same language, but we have different laws to a degree over here in Northern Ireland. If they were
Yeah,
part of the UK, it's different. How
yeah.
difficult was it for you, having been trained at Queen's University in Belfast, to then go over to England and say, oh, well, that's not how we do it in Belfast? How difficult was it?
Yeah, well, interestingly, in terms of Northern Ireland and England, it's not actually as different as you would think. It's a different legal jurisdiction. But what they tend to do is, over here in England, they'll pass a statute. And what used to always happen is it would then end up going back to Northern Ireland. Obviously, the days of direct rule, I suppose, weren't, thankfully, where the Assembly's thankfully up and running again. But in the days of direct rule, you would just have a piece of legislation, and then they would stick on to the end of it, Northern Ireland order. So it would kind of be the same thing, but they would just kind of say, well, this is also for Northern Ireland. England and Wales is a separate and distinct legal
Mm.
jurisdiction, but actually the laws are pretty similar in Northern Ireland. I think when I've spoken to friends who are in practice in Northern Ireland, I think that things like conveyancing is quite similar. I think employment law is a wee bit different. There's some other areas of law which are very different, but things like contract law and various other things are very similar. And the legislation generally isn't as distinct as you might think, different as it might be. It's different in Scotland. Scotland's a whole different kettle of fish, really, but it's not massively different. And when I went over to London to law school, they were really just teaching principles in terms of when you're a barrister, how you do certain things. So it wasn't actually as different as maybe it would seem going across to England.
We'll talk more about your lawyership, if that's the right word. Your lawyering.
Yeah, lawyering, yes.
Later on, that's okay. But it's interesting that in 2008, you went over to Africa, to Rwanda, Kenya,
Yep.
and
Uganda.
yeah,
Yeah.
what was it like over there? And more importantly, why did you actually
Yeah.
want to go over there in the first place?
Yeah, so I went over there because at the time I was working for the Lawyers Christian Fellowship. I was working with Christian law students at the time, so I kind of had to in that respect, because it was part of my job. And I remember being in the airport in London, getting ready to get onto this flight. I was just thinking, oh, what are we doing here? This is Africa. Why are we going to Africa? And I really wasn't looking forward to it, to be honest. We had all these injections beforehand, which was a nightmare. Getting all this sort of yellow fever and stuff, and actually getting yellow fever for a bit, in terms of just getting it in the system so you could be immune to it. And I remember feeling really ill, and I've never had so many injections. But actually, the preparation was interesting because in terms of Rwanda, we were obviously thinking about the
Yeah.
genocide and preparing for that and reading various books. When I got over there, I mean, it said a lot, but it genuinely was life changing. I think it was in Uganda, people are just thrown into prison. There's no indication as to when they're actually going to get out. There could be trumped up charges and someone's just chucked into prison. They won't have a hearing maybe for weeks and weeks. They can't get access to a lawyer. So they were relying on people like us, who were basically law students coming in and trying to help them. And we couldn't really do very much. But the level of corruption over there is huge. And that was pretty frightening because I think over here we criticize our legal system and it's not
Hmm.
perfect. But actually, when you look at the system in other parts of the world and how corrupt it is and how broken it is, we're actually pretty fortunate.
Give us an example of that, Soraya, of what corruption actually means when you were over there.
In terms of a judge, if a judge is going to give a particular judgment, if the lawyer knows the judge, the lawyer will potentially pay the judge a bribe, that kind of thing. And it's that sort of stark. And I think unfortunately it's similar. This legal system to some extent can be the same, in that if people have money to pay, then they can achieve more sometimes. And I think over there that was really prominent. I mean, Rwanda was incredible. It's such a beautiful country, and it's in the news a lot, obviously. But I just thought it was a beautiful, beautiful country. But the genocide, we went to the genocide sites, and it was
Mm.
heartbreaking. It was obviously years afterwards, but they had kept the sites, they had kept people's shoes who were murdered, and it just was completely heartbreaking to see what happened there, and trying to kind of make sense of it all in terms of how in a sense how God let all this stuff happen, this genocide where kids are killed and macheted, and it was really hard. It was helpful because it makes you really think and it makes you really try and understand this idea of justice. And there's a book called Good News About Injustice by Gary Haugen, which is a fantastic book, which I'd really recommend. He talks about going to see the genocide sort of immediately afterwards and experiencing, seeing bodies there and everything else, and just how the impact that had on him, and then the questions he has for God about that, and how, in a sense, God responds. It's a really good book, and he can put it an awful lot better than I can. But it was a really life changing experience, I think.
And just to bail you out, Tim Grainger said that, money can buy you stuff in this country. I think what you're alluding to is that, yes, if you are very, very rich, you can most probably afford the greatest barrister who knows every little nuance. That's what you're saying, isn't it, in this country?
Precisely, yeah. I mean, my point there is it's access to justice is as much of a problem over here sometimes, because if a client comes into a solicitor's office and says, right, I've been wronged and I want to try and find a solution to it, if there's any quote for how much it'll cost them to achieve that, most people would say that's an awful lot, couldn't possibly afford that. And yet those that are perhaps have the money and are in themselves perhaps corrupt and whatever else, we see it with someone like Donald Trump, I would suggest, who has the money to be able to throw at things and pay people off and whatever. And that's where you can see the injustice. And I think over here, people that can't afford lawyers, even, I think more has to be
Yeah.
done, because there just isn't enough people need access to justice over here, and it's not available
Yeah,
for everyone.
yeah, yeah. Going back to Rwanda, especially, and your time over there, going around those three countries, what did you actually personally get out of it in regard to your relationship with God?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it opened my eyes, and I think it helped me understand that it's good and it's healthy to ask questions of God and to not always have the answers communicated, and that's okay. I think increasingly I sort of see that you look at the Old Testament, you look at Moses, who was described as being a friend of
Mm.
God. The way he spoke to God, the questions he asked, and I think it's understanding that God encourages that. He encourages questions. He wants us to think. We're not designed to be robots. So I think that helped me at a fairly early stage in my legal career and life and Christian life generally, to be okay with asking God questions and keep asking the questions and get an answer sometimes, and sometimes having to wrestle with things.
That's a really good answer. Well, let's take it a bit further then. You've already mentioned LCF, which
Yeah.
stands for Lawyers Christian Fellowship. We often hear that every so often in the news as well. Tell us more about it, please.
Yeah, it was set up. It was something like 18 something or other. It was set up a long
Yeah.
time ago, and it was set up as a prayer union originally. So it was to have a space for Christian lawyers to pray, and it's had famous lawyers, if you like, involved. Lord Denning is a really well known Christian lawyer who has He's given judgments on lots
He
of
has.
well-known cases. Really interesting guy, fantastic brain, really strong Christian. Going on a bit of a sort of side thing here, but his a lot of his judgments, changed where law was going, contractual law and everything else. His judgments very often are what even law students now going to law school are still reading Denning judgments. So, and he's a Christian guy who really sort of set a lot of precedents. He was involved, and it's kind of grown over the years. It now really, I suppose, the central aim that we have is to encourage Christian lawyers to be a support to them. We don't necessarily get involved in speaking into the public space, if you like. At a time we did, but there's lots of other organisations do that well. Some maybe not so well.
Yeah.
But I think our focus is very much on trying to encourage Christian lawyers to, in their practice, glorify God and sort of understand their calling, if you like, and see that outworked. So that's our real focus, is to encourage them, and particularly, and I have a bit of a heart for folks that are coming into law, students and young lawyers coming into a really challenging world with all kinds of complexities and laws that are difficult, and just how can you grapple with that as a Christian lawyer, and how do you do that with with grace and with compassion, and with boldness as well. So but we're there to try and help with those answers as much as we can, I suppose.
Yeah. I suppose when you're over in those African countries and you see the corruption, I take it from 2008 when you were there, it hasn't really changed much. So how can you change the corruption principle that seems to be endemic throughout those countries there?
I mean, I remember as part of the LCF, we went over to Macedonia, myself, and when I was working for the LCF, and a couple of others. I'd never been to Macedonia. I'd read about it in the Bible. I'd never actually been. It was a fantastic. I think we were there for a week. We had lots of lawyers from kind of that, so the Balkans and that kind of area, and it was all about corruption. I remember just thinking it's the same thing, because I was presenting a talk, and I didn't feel at all able to talk about
Mm.
corruption as a mid-20-year-old, lawyer who didn't really know, hadn't really experienced an awful lot. But I think what struck me was that the sort of 100 delegates or whoever were there, I think it's one lawyer at a time. It just takes, one or two, three, four or five people to stand up to be able to say this isn't right, this isn't the way things should be. I mean, there's that quote which I'm going to misquote, I'm sure, but for evil to prosper, it requires good people to do nothing or stay silent or something like that.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
if that's the quote, and I think that's right when it comes to stuff like corruption, because if we all sort of say, well, actually, you know what, there's always going to be corruption, so what's the point? I think that we all have an opportunity in sometimes really small ways, but if there's enough light, the darkness is so great that if there's enough light, little pockets of light, that's going to make a bit of a difference, So it's a bit at a time, I think.
yeah, which is a great answer. And, if there was corruption in the UK, I would like to think that yourself and others would say, hang on a minute, Mr. Judge, we believe you're being corrupt here. Look at the newspapers. They're saying you're corrupt as well. So that's that. But in African countries, maybe I'm wrong here, but you just get the feeling that if you did stand up, that'd be like the last breath you have. There'd be a bullet with your name on it.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I think it's harder probably for for people to sort of stand up and say anything. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are some that do so, but I think it's having the platform. I mean, I suppose these days with social media and everything else, it's maybe easier for people to get a message out there. But then there's so many competing messages
Yeah.
that maybe that's less straightforward. But maybe something like social media, which wasn't as prominent back in 2008, for example, might be a thing that can be used for good.
Yeah, well, let's hope that in 2024, that those three countries, there's no such thing as corruption anymore, especially as they're in the news quite often. It's been
Yeah,
eradicated,
yeah.
which would be really, really good. In fact, let's take it a bit further now with yourself. We've talked about corruption. We'll leave that to one side. If you are representing somebody in a big case,
Mm.
you must have been challenged from time to time with your own Christian morals, thinking, hang on a minute, this bloke is absolutely swinging a lead here.
Mm.
He's more guilty than the most guilty man I've ever met. So what do you do?
So my practice is employment law now. So it's a slightly different thing. I think when I first went into law, I wanted to do criminal law.
Hmm.
That was my hope. And I remember as part of my experience, if you like, I went to what they call clerking. So I basically was hired by a solicitor's firm to take notes at a murder trial in Bristol. And there was a legal team there. So there were two barristers, a QC as they were KC now, but QC as they were then. plus another junior barrister who would have been still, well into their 50s, but they're still called junior barristers, and then a solicitor, and then me. There was this legal team. Now, in this case, it was a double shooting, London and Bristol, that happened, I think, at the same time. It was gang related. There were about 9 defendants. So the courtroom was full of lawyers, plus, jury and everything else. And that for me was an experience because I was able to go down to the cells with the barrister and meet the client and things. And it did occur to me that the client probably knew more about the law than I did at that point. And the barrister knew that rightly, I think. And in the end, I remember, so I was staying in Bristol. The firm that I was with, they put me up, which was quite nice. So I was there for a couple of weeks and hadn't been to Bristol, so that was nice to see that. I remember that all of them were acquitted, and I couldn't believe it. The barrister phoned me, I think, or texted me, I can't remember, and said everyone's not guilty. And I thought, how on earth, how could that be? Because that just doesn't seem right. And I suppose the criminal system, for example, the standard of proof is so high, beyond reasonable doubt is a high bar. And you just have to sow that wee bit of doubt, I suppose, in someone's mind. I suppose what I'm saying in a roundabout way is I think that Christian lawyers need to be everywhere in every aspect of law. I think criminal defense work is probably one of the hardest areas to be a Christian lawyer. But then I also think that you still have the risk, and it still happens, where someone hasn't done something, someone's innocent. And I think that for someone innocent to go to prison is a horrible thing, is a terrible thing.
Yeah.
And I think everyone deserves a fair chance. The system is set up here that it should work in that there's checks and balances. So you've got, in criminal law, prosecution, a defense, jury, and then a judge. And I think that when the system works well, it does work really well, but it's not perfect. And I suppose you reflect on, as Christians, if someone is guilty and they aren't, it's a different conversation, but there isn't then justice for them. Well, we believe that there will be justice at some point, but I think criminal law is a really difficult area to be involved in, and employment law is less like that, I have to say.
We'll talk about employment law in a minute, give people a better understanding of what you do. But it's interesting, that statement. You think that of all the cases in law, criminal law is probably the worst one to be in as far as a Christian is concerned, a Christian lawyer. Why is that?
I think part of it is what you hear, what you see. I suppose you see the worst of people. If it's a serious murder trial or whatever, it's shocking, I think. So I think to be able to deal with that sort of thing every day, to go to work and think I've got another murder case or I've got an assault case, that's hard for anyone. But I think that's why it would make that job particularly difficult. Yeah, so I think that's probably why I would say that's one of the most difficult areas to be in.
You've said something very poignant there as well. The police often get a bad press, but when you think about those police officers that have to deal with child abuse, and the reams and reams of photos that they obviously have to see, how they cope, I don't know. I don't know what their strategy is, but yes, you've made a very good point on that. So please pray for your local police officer that has to do that sort of thing, because I wouldn't want to do it. Employment law, though, what does that actually mean, please, Tim?
So in terms of what my job tends to involve, so I tend to see people who are employees who usually have some sort of dispute with their employer, one way or the other. And I suppose it's trying to find a solution to that particular dispute. So it's still a form of dispute resolution most of the time. Now, I do more sort of standard, what you call non-contentious things, such as drafting contracts of employment for people, and if an employer says they would like a particular policy on disciplinary policy or grievance policy, then I can draft one of those for them and that kind of thing. But probably most of what I do is trying to solve disputes, whether on behalf of the employer or the employee. And there's a bit of a niche area which I've not necessarily wanted to develop, but between pastors and churches now, actually seeing a lot of those cases. And there's another really good firm who deal with the churches. The churches will instruct them, and then this firm will call me and say, can you act for the pastor? And then between us, we try and actually find a way forward and a solution that will stop it going to an employment tribunal. But since COVID, I think there's been an awful lot more of this, some high profile stuff perhaps, and some less so. But yeah, that's what's pretty hard at the moment when I get those sorts of cases through, because there's a bigger picture, if you like, with them.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, you can't name names at all.
Yeah.
But what is the number one reason at the moment do you see as to why you're being called in to sort out employer versus employee?
I think what often happens is people don't communicate properly, and they let things fester, and then things develop and grow, and then someone just eventually says, right, I've had enough. And these days, I mean, I often see exchanges of WhatsApp messages and emails, and they become increasingly unpleasant, and
Yeah,
people just think they can sit behind a keyboard and say whatever they want. And I always say to clients, never write an email in anger, because the next morning you'll regret it, frankly, and always take a moment. And there's an email that you may want to write, keep that in your head, and then filter it, and then write something
yeah.
quite different in the end. So I think, yeah, probably lack of communication. So many of these things could be sorted out if people just spoke to each other, took a moment, but too often that doesn't happen.
How much is social media at fault for this then?
Yeah, I think increasingly it's a problem, because I mean, I've had situations where employees have put something on social media and been sacked for it because they've breached the social media policy or whatever. But I think on a broader point, with social media, people sort of feel they've got this way to communicate now with everyone all the time, and
Yeah,
that can be healthy maybe. I think also it's really dangerous, because we all want to be affirmed one way or the other. And I think social media is a thing where, if you're constantly seeking affirmation that way, it's really dangerous. And I think social media I think it's a bit out of control, if I'm honest. I think now we're all kind of sucked into it, and it's a massive, massive thing. I mean, our kids are getting to the stage where they're at school, and I remember when I was at school, there weren't there weren't mobile phones, and now people are coming home, they've got mobile phones, and they're still in contact. And if kids are having difficulties at school, that doesn't stop at school. It continues, over when they're at home on their phones. And
yeah.
yeah, I think social media has that seeps into workplaces, I think, as well, and it could be quite dangerous.
We talk about reconciliation, especially with a word that you've mentioned a few times, which really floated my boat when I was reading your biography online, social media. It's a word that I like to be challenged on, and that's injustice and fairness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to know more why that is such a big thing for you. You've already mentioned about the bullying at school that maybe put you into the idea of going down the lawyership route, but tell us more
Yeah.
about being fair and injustice, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think injustice, is something that it's so prevalent, really. I think, and the level of justice that we have on Earth, if you like, is only goes so far. And but I think when I've had cases where that's the right result, that ultimately, if you like, justice has been done, without sort of sounding too grandiose about it. There's nothing quite like that, to know that you've started a case 2 years ago with someone, you've walked the road with them, you've got an outcome that they're satisfied with. That's fantastic. I think the hard thing, to be quite honest, in law is that a lot of the times things settle. So things don't go to court, so people have this idea of people wearing wigs and gowns, and it's all very grand and things. A lot of what happens, actually, a lot of my work is being on the phone to the other solicitor maybe 2 days before the trial, and settling the case and saying, right, what can we do to find a solution? And then that's it. When I've sat in my office and I've had clients sitting opposite who've then broken down in tears because of how difficult, because of how they've been bullied at work, for example,
Yeah.
and they've just had this boss, and you'll read some of the things that have been said, and you think, how is this happening in a workplace? How is this person being spoken to by another human being like this? And how did we get here? And that's when I feel I want to step in at that point and say, right, I'm on your side, I'm in your corner. This isn't going to be easy, and we might not win, but let's see if we can try and get you out of that workplace, or whatever. And that's what really gets me excited, I suppose. And that the cases aren't all like that. Some of them are a lot drier than that, but there are definitely those ones that stand out because someone has truly been trodden on.
Mm.
Absolutely, like bullying, and it happens all the time. And I don't see that. I really enjoy my work and my workplace, but I know there are some real toxic work environments out there, and people need to be able to speak out about that and speak to people about that. And I say to clients, no job is worth staying in if it's making you ill. It's just not. No job is worth that. Your health suffering. It just isn't. So So I think that's where I sort of see fairness and justice being outworked, if you like, in I suppose in employment law.
Well, as far as a Christian is concerned, then an LCF, which we've alluded to, how much of that is a hindrance, do you think, from a future client's perspective? Think, oh, he's a Christian, he's not going to do anything because he's just going to be nice.
It's really interesting because the firm I'm in, we've been established 30 years, and we're in Warrington, but we're in a village just outside. Everyone knows we're a Christian firm. The firm was set up by our senior partner because the firm she was in wouldn't let her talk about her faith, so she set up a Christian firm.
Oh, really?
And that was 30 years ago, and God's honored what she did. Our office has a little fish, on the kind of the signage and stuff like that, so people locally know we're Christians. But it's interesting because, and on our kind of letterhead it talks about, we're involved in the LCF and things, but I've never had that with people. I've never had anyone. I mean, maybe some don't know, maybe some are ignorant to it, but I think once you sit across the table from someone and I suppose I'm always learning, and I've got so much more to learn, but people really appreciate honesty and authenticity, and I hope they see that from us as a firm, that actually we're not going to say to them, oh, we're going to promise the earth or whatever. I hope we can be really honest and straightforward with them, and actually people appreciate that. And you can have lawyers in kind of big expensive buildings with expensive flashy suits and whatever else, but actually just sitting down and being honest with someone. And I think being able to be you're not someone's friend, but you're someone, you're someone who you want to be in their corner. And I think people appreciate, your faith. I mean, there definitely been some over the years who have then picked on that if they've not got the right result.
Yeah.
And I've had a couple of horrible emails, maybe more than a couple, where they would sort of say, "Oh, what would Jesus do?" And just really, really horrible. But I've also had Christian clients who have sometimes been somewhat challenging. I don't think it is a hindrance. I think that, our senior partner took that step so many years ago, and God's honored that actually, and we can see it because the firm continues to grow and is still going.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, a Christian client has had a go at you, and it's like, whoa, hang on a minute. If that's the case, how much of it do you think is greed as like the main source of the issue here, either from a client's perspective or from an employer's perspective?
Yeah, it can be greed or it can just be anger. It can just be, I've seen that where it's just been people being so angry, and that's all that drives them. So whether it's an employee who's absolutely certain that this one person has wronged them, and I've had it over the years where I've had a client who's been absolutely certain that everyone's out to get them, and actually they're really not. It's taken over their life, it's
Yeah.
consumed them, and it's really sad actually because it's consumed them more than the person that they were bringing the case against, for example, and it's eaten them away. And you can see that any kind of joy or peace that they could have had has just gone because they're so determined to punish that person. So there can be an element of greed, but very often it can just be driven by anger, and I've seen people really behave in a way which is just, really, really strange. And I've seen emails which are just bizarre, and just folks really, any of us could do it, I suppose, but just really not thinking straight in terms of how they're communicating and what they're saying, and how damaging maybe their words could be to other people. So I think anger drives people sometimes.
But how difficult is it for you personally? I know you said you're working for a Christian firm, which is great, but how difficult is it for you at times to say, oh, do you know what? I wish I wasn't a Christian today. It'd be so much easier. Let me just park my Christian faith there, God. I'm going to leave it there. I'll pick it up at 5 o'clock tonight when I leave. All right, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock when I leave.
Yeah.
But no, I can't do it today as a Christian. How often have you had that sort of feeling?
I don't know. I think I've certainly had moments when I've just felt under the cosh, and I suppose you look at maybe others. Again, it's in the Bible all the time. You look at others and say, well, they seem to have a really easy life. They seem to be able to do X, Y, and Z, and things are really straightforward, and everything falls in the right place. And I'm dealing with this challenging person on the other side of whatever the case or the client, and where are you, God, in all of this, and how on earth can we find a solution? And there have been times when I've taken things quite personally from clients, I suppose, and I've been quite offended. And maybe in my early years of practice, I would have had sleepless nights. I would have felt ill. I think I've got to the point where I roll with the punches a lot more now, and I hope that's because my faith's a wee bit deeper as well. I can see that, actually, if I didn't have God in all of this, I would be terrible. I would be even worse, and I wouldn't have the patience and I wouldn't have the grace. And I think if I didn't have the grace,
That's a great statement. Why, though? Why wouldn't you have that? Because as you get older, surely, and I'm not trying to be controversial deliberately, but
yeah,
expand on that, please.
I think I've got to the point where, I mean, I'm 15 years in practice, I think now, something like that. And, it's that sort of well-worn phrase, there's nothing new under the sun.
Mm.
And there's almost nothing that surprises me now. Whatever I hear or see, nothing really surprises me because I think I know the human heart can be really dark and can make all kinds of mistakes. I suppose it's then understanding the level of grace that we're shown by God through Jesus, just how the more I see in my own life too, the more I see how sinful I am and how much of a mess I make of things.
Yeah.
Seeing the level of grace that God shows through Jesus, I'm beginning to understand that just that wee bit more every year. I think a wee bit more. I realize how I'm lost without God. I think, to be quite honest, I realize that the older I get, you have these pipe dreams when you're younger. You think, I want to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm at the point where, I mean, I'm early 40s, but I'm thinking, yeah, it's a bit harder to run as quick as it used to be able to, and things hurt a bit more. And actually, I could see how some days I could get quite grumpy about that and think this getting older things, this isn't great. But actually, I've seen other older Christians in my life, and I've seen how they have grown old with grace and have become really incredible people of faith because they spend time with God and they know God, and you can just see it. And I suppose I hope that as I get older, I just have that bit more grace and that I realize that the focus isn't on me, it's on other people. And I kind of I serve other people. I want to help and live for other people. And I'm an awfully long way off that, as my wife would testify, but it's trying to get a bit closer to that, I think.
That's a great answer. For those that are listening today, then, that are really struggling with the fact that they might feel bullied at work, or they are being bullied at work, or maybe actually they are the bullies in work themselves, what would you say to them to encourage them? From your point of view, giving them 10 minutes free advice, what would you say to them?
I think I would say for those being bullied, it's really important that you speak to someone about it. You find someone who will listen, and you're not afraid of someone judging you, if you like, for what you say. You've someone who's just prepared to listen and let you sort of offload whatever it is. So I think make sure that you don't just kind of carry on being bullied without doing something about it, because the reality is the law is there to try and protect, to try and enforce people's rights, and employment law is no different. So the reason we have the legislation we have is that if someone is just sacked on the spot without a good reason, it's an unfair dismissal claim, etc. And
Yeah.
the Equality Act is really complicated, but it's there. It's designed to protect people for various reasons and protected characteristics and whatever else. So if you're being bullied, the law is there, but there's people there, and find people you can speak to. Yes, ideally find a lawyer in due course, but I would say, find people, close people, who you can speak to. And I think people who are bullying probably don't even know they're doing it sometimes. I think there are those who will just be getting on with it and won't be interested in changing. But I think we all have to be really careful about how we speak to people, because we're all wired differently. And, we could say something that we think is funny or whatever, and actually it really offends the other person. And it's, we're in
Yes.
the particular culture that we live in, maybe things go a bit far sometimes, but I think it's just being really careful about how we communicate and what we say and things like that.
Speak now to somebody before it just morphs into something that you can't control anymore.
Yeah, definitely.
You have mentioned Warrington a couple of times. Now, bear with me on this. Honestly, I'm not here to try and catch you out. A friend of ours in the 70s came over to work in Chester from Northern Ireland. And of course, here in Northern Ireland at the time, it wasn't a great place to live in because of what is now known as the Troubles. And he felt when he was working there in Chester in the NHS, he was actually being bullied by people in England saying, look what you lot are doing. You're killing people. Our soldiers have gone over there to help you out and you're killing them. And he had a real rough deal. We know, unfortunately, what happened in Warrington quite a few years ago now.
Yeah, yeah.
You from Northern Ireland, working in Warrington, what have you seen? What have you gleaned from your time there? What did people say to you about the terrible sadness of the anniversary of the Warrington bombing?
Yeah, it's interesting because When I first moved over here, I was based in a place called Great Sankey, which is in Warrington, and round the corner was the Peace Centre, which was built, I think, shortly after the bomb in Warrington. So that's kind of always there as I mean, I think it's used by school kids and various other folks. But in the centre of Warrington, there is a memorial to the two boys that were killed. I mean, I suppose the people here, they're quite stoic about things. I think, I mean, I do see a similarity between Northern Irish people and folks in the northern part of England. I do feel an affinity there, really, and I've always felt incredibly welcomed. Really, I've always felt people obviously hear the accent and will sometimes say, "Oh, where are you
Yeah.
from?" And that's always good conversation. But it's interesting because a lot of the folks that I go to church with, none of us really ever chose Warrington. We never sort of said, where would we like to end up and sort of spend our working life. None of us would have said Warrington. But it's really interesting that so many of us have ended up here from. I mean, in my church, we've got other Northern Irish folk and people from other different parts of England, Scotland, and whatever. And it's just really interesting that a lot of people end up here because the town, I mean, it's well known for its rugby league and things like
Yeah.
that. And I have a real soft spot for the place now, but there's nothing particularly glamorous or special about it. But I suppose without being over spiritual, I can see that God's he's definitely doing something, I think, in the town. I can see there's a real fire in places and there's a real enthusiasm and the churches are working together on a number of projects, which is really good. And there's just a lot of good people. I think a lot of just honest, good people who just want to get on with things. So I think it's somewhere I'm very happy with to live. And I think interestingly, our two daughters speak Warringtonian, notwithstanding the fact that my wife and I have Northern Irish accents, and our wee boy, I'm sure, will also have a Warringtonian accent in due course as well.
Well, it's good to know that everything seems to be coming together and that churches are talking to each other in Warrington.
Yeah.
Wish that would happen throughout the rest of the world if churches was talked together. Be amazed what would happen if it did. And talking of the world, you went over to United Nations to help out an NGO.
Yeah, non-governmental organisation. Yeah, so
what was all that about then?
yeah, it was really random, to be honest. So I when I was working for the LCF, so I worked for the LCF for 2 years, and I think it was the first year we were working with an organisation called CARE, who are based down in London,
Mm-hmm.
and the LCF and CARE would work together on things. Certainly at that time, they needed someone to go over to Geneva to just in terms of sort of what was happening at the UN, just to kind of sit in and sort of take notes and report back, really. And I ended up going, which I'm not quite sure how I managed to pull that off, to be honest. But I was very willing to go and went over, and I spent actually, I think at one point I was there for about a month on my own in Geneva, going back into the United Nations. I wasn't speaking or anything. I was just there, kind of taking notes and then reporting back to CARE in terms of what had happened during the day.
Yeah.
It was a really interesting experience because I was able, sort of the downtime, was able to kind of look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is kind of framed in the kind of the museum there and stuff. And when you're walking around, there's lots of peacocks that are just walking freely and stuff like that. So it's part of the guy who kind of bought the place or set it up, whatever. That was one of his stipulations, that he wanted peacocks all the time walking around. You see these things would appear all of a sudden. But it was a beautiful, beautiful city, incredibly expensive. Not easy to live there for 4 months, sort of living on very cheap pizza. Yeah, it was a really good experience, which I'm really, really thankful for because at the time I didn't really think about it that much, but actually it was a great thing to be involved with.
Yeah, and what did you learn from that you've now been able to apply? Because it's all very well, you hear so many students go over to do these sorts of things, but in reality, what have you actually learned from it? So from your time there, what have you learned from it?
I think, to be honest, without sounding too cynical, I think the problem with the United Nations is that there's a lot of good intentions. So you'd have this, you'd sort of see they were going to talk about, there was a paper produced about violence against women or whatever, and this was, surely everyone can get behind what this means. And then there's a draft that's produced, and then it's redrafted, and then it's redrafted, and then it's redrafted, and then what actually comes about doesn't really say anything or do anything. And I think my experience of the UN probably was that the ideas are great, but the actual implementation, if they're talking about human rights abuses in various parts of the world, whether it be North Korea or anywhere like that, nothing was actually really done about it. There was lots of talk, but then you always had the significant world powers that wouldn't accept there was a problem. So you'd have certain countries saying, well, there's a human right abuse happening here, But then you'd have other countries saying, no, we don't consider it's human rights abuses and whatever else. And it was just a talking shop to some extent, where lots of money was pumped into the whole thing, but actually seeing what was being done about it, I find was a bit frustrating, because in reality, there was quite a gap between what was said and what was actually done. So in terms of the United Nations, and sort of what what can be done going forwards and things, I think the problem is that it's kind of the classic situation with politics, which can be described as the art of compromise, and
Yeah.
there can be so much compromise that nothing actually gets done. So I think that was one of the frustrations, that actually there isn't as much action. There's a lot of talk and not enough action sometimes.
Before we move on to the final question, because our time is almost up now, and obviously I want to know who your Christian hero is, two questions to frame at you, if that's all right. First one is, because you mentioned you've been in practice for 15 years, two-part question. First of all, what have you learnt about yourself in those 15 years? And secondly, what have you learnt about your spiritual life in those 15 years?
Goodness, it's a good question. What I've learned about myself, I think I've learned that I still have a lot to learn, probably. I've probably learned that when it comes to practicing law, you have these kind of grand ideas of what it will be like, and I think I've learned to be myself when I'm practicing law. I don't need to be someone else, because I think we have this thing in Northern Ireland that we speak in a certain way that's quite sort of, it's good for breaking bad news. It's quite a lilty accent, and I think when I first went to England, I realized, particularly in the south of England, people sound as if they really know what they're talking about, and I find that quite intimidating. Go to London and I'd listen to someone, and actually they weren't saying anything, but it sounded really intelligent, and I think probably I had a bit of a complex by that.
Yeah,
But actually, I think I've realized that I've learned that I could just be myself, and actually people appreciate that. They appreciate that authenticity, I think, and
yeah.
so I think I've learned that. What was the second part of the question, Martin? Sorry.
What have you learnt spiritually in the 15 years?
That I absolutely need. I can't practice law without Jesus being in the middle of it. Absolutely, I couldn't countenance life generally, but I absolutely need that foundation in my life and in my practice, because I think the job, like any job, it's stressful,
Mm.
it's hard, and you could use different metrics. I think if you got into the sort of position of trying to say, well, this is what a good lawyer is. A good lawyer is someone who hits their billing targets, or achieves this result, or becomes a judge, or you keep on moving that. And I think you realize, actually sometimes God's called you to be in a certain place, and you glorify him where you are, and that's what the everyday thing is about. It's not kind of constantly moving the goalposts. So I think my spiritual life, I hope that what I'm learning, and I'm not very good at it, but it's just to be kind of at peace, just to be content where I'm called to be, I think, and to realize that my identity is in Christ, and not to use a metric of achieving this billing target, or this particular success in a case, or becoming a judge, or those kinds of things, because those goalposts constantly could be moved.
Yeah.
Because basically, if for some reason I couldn't practice law tomorrow, where would my identity be? And it's always going to be in Christ. It ultimately has to be only there. So I think it's trying to rest in that. And I'm not always good at that, absolutely not. But it's trying to get closer to having that peace and that rest, I think.
Yeah, do you know what? I was thinking that when you were talking that, well, have I got the guts to ask him that? If tomorrow morning you wake up, or yesterday morning, let's say you woke up yesterday morning, and God said, actually, I want you to come out of lawyership, lawyering, would you have the strength to do
Yeah.
that?
I think once it kind of, if I knew that was the right thing, if I was really sure that was the right thing, I think my greatest problem with that would not be the lack of lawyering. It would be the lack of certainty, because I'm a real stickler for, I definitely have a mild case of OCD. I
Mm-hmm.
like things to be a certain way. I like to be able to know, that this month we're going to be okay financially. I like things to be in order. I'd probably struggle more with, well, then what happens next, and will we be okay? And I mean, I've known in my Christian life, I've always known that when God's kind of made a call, it tends to be the right one.
Yeah.
So I think I've learned to try and be obedient, because it always kind of works out in the end, although not always maybe as we think it might.
For those that are listening today, then, that are really struggling with their own personal life, because, I do say at the top end that maybe you're just disillusioned, what would you say to them in closing?
I would say keep going. I mean, I run marathons in my spare time. It's a corny illustration, but I find that when you're running a marathon, you go through all kinds of emotions. At the start of it, you feel excited and elated, but about mile 20, you're thinking, "What on earth am I doing? Why did I ever commit to do this?" And I think that as a Christian, I mean, it's used in the Bible all the time. It is a good illustration, because there will be times where you just feel like giving up, feel like saying, "What's the point? Why are we is God even there? What's happening? And I think, as I said earlier, it's always good to have questions, but it's also really important to tell God all those things and to keep going. And I think in my life I've always found, get good people around you.
Yeah.
Get 2 or 3 really good friends who you can just be honest with and say, this is really rubbish. What do you think? And being prepared to have those friends who will challenge, but also who will just sit with you, who won't necessarily have the answer. And to be honest, they're sometimes the best friends, So it's having those good people around you, I think is really important.
Great answer. And of course, just to amplify what you said, just go and talk it through with somebody. Just go and talk and listen.
Yeah.
And if all else fails, pray about it, really. Tim, listen, it's been brilliant. Let's quickly close then, because you've got a job to do, like look after your family and things like that. Tim Grainger, who is your Christian hero, please?
Yeah, this is actually really tough, and I'm afraid I'm going to go for probably an answer which has been given on many, many occasions, I'm quite sure. Probably C.S. Lewis.
Hardly ever have him. Go for it.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, go for it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, Clive Staples. Let's go for it, please.
I just think that such an interesting guy, clearly a fantastic mind, but I just think he went through it himself. He can write something like the Chronicles of Narnia, but then also write, something like the Screwtape Letters as well. And I think just the insight he has and had is really incredible. So I just think there's just something really unique about him and how he was used by God. And people continue to quote him, time and time again. And there's just a real, again, a real honesty about how he communicates, and he can communicate to kids in his books, but also say something incredibly poignant to adults as well. So I just think, incredible guy who just seemed to really had a lot of good answers, but also again was quite comfortable with asking difficult questions too.
A pure coincidence, but of course he comes from Northern Ireland.
Pure coincidence, that's true. Yeah.
An amazing mind he had. That's a very good answer as well. Tim Grainger, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great to hear from you. I really enjoyed what you've been able to share and your honesty for doing it as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tim.
Thanks, Martin. Pleasure.